Well, before I begin, I'd just like to, first thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here today, and to share with you some of the ideas I've been thinking over for the last few years since I left my employment with the Australian Army about what Australia actually needs in a security policy. And I would also like to recognize the Wadjuk Noongar people for making this land available for this place where we're speaking here today. Now, talking about redefining Australian national security, it's because we need to redefine it, because I think it's all basically fundamentally broken. And if you look at it dispassionate, it doesn't make much sense. It's really, and the only way it does make sense if you put it into the context of the American flag. But of course, like all defense policies, it's aiming to achieve something rather simple. One is to protect our territory, and as the other speakers have said, there's absolutely no threat to our territory, and that's just a function of fortunate geography. Being an island continent's really handy. But the government also makes quite a point, and if you've looked at the Defense Strategic Review or the National Strategy, they make this, they keep reiterating defending the global rules-based order, and of course, as we all know, that's code for the US-led economic system that is currently in use around the world. So that's really the true goal of what the government is trying to achieve. And they do it by various means, and the others, other speakers have covered this too. And, this dependency on the United States. And frankly, since 1901, Australia's security has been one of dependency, first the UK, now the US. So there's nothing new here. It's been around for 123 years as the chosen policy of this country. And our political masters, political elites, have gotten so used to it, it's just on a default setting now. There's no attempt to ever rethink any other option. They just immediately default to it. And we embrace the role of being a sub-imperial power, which refers back to this global rules-based order, which we sort of slide underneath. And of course, that comes with consequences, which means we have to adopt a policy for the United States. And we all seem pretty convinced that there's a war coming with China and that our participation is guaranteed. And I think that's pretty much the case. But more insidiously, we also design and build our defense force, the Australian Defense Force, to be a miniature US Defense Force. So our Air Force is a wing of the US Air Force, our Navy joins a task force of the US Navy, and our Army falls under the command of a US Land Force commander. And that's the way it was in Iraq, and Afghanistan, Vietnam, and World War II. And then you could also go back through the British line with the same things. Our defense force actually, even though it has Australian there, cannot fight on its own. It's not designed or meant to fight on its own. It's not equipped to fight on its own. It must fight as a subset of the United States. So, and Devin has covered this largely, we need a policy that actually looks to Australia's interests, and then build and design a defense force that meets that. And I would also say the government needs to have a degree of honesty here, which is not, in their messaging. They never are honest. And people have asked me about this, and I just say the only real way to say it is that the government lies to us about the relationship with the United States. And that comes with all kinds of consequences, which we'll get to. So, if we were to have an Australian security policy, what would that look like? Well, some of it is pretty obvious. The policy side is all pretty obvious because this is what most countries do. There's no secret science to this, all right? There's no great Ouija board mystery, all right? All countries do this, all right? You prioritize your own interests. You protect your own territory. You don't worry about, other things like that. And you, in the modern era, support the international agencies that help, eliminate or reduce the instances of wars and, create mechanisms for nations to resolve their disputes without violence, such as the United Nations and all the agencies that the United Nations had established. And of course, diplomacy should be the number one go-to when you're considering, when you have a problem with another nation. Now, unfortunately, the United States' default setting is to resort to force as their first setting. And, they can do that because they are very powerful. And that's unfortunate. Because diplomacy is a much more effective tool, far less costly, and doesn't kill quite as many people. And we should be prioritizing diplomacy over military responses. And most important of all, we need to look at this as a holistic national interest. It is more than just about the military. So, how do we start to bring this about? How do we start to forge a new security policy? Well, I think for a starting point, and these are some of the points that I've put here, and David Shoebridge made this quite clear, is to expose dependency for what it truly is, and it is a loss of sovereignty, right? And it's not only just a loss of parts of Australian territory or putting Australian territory under risk of attack, it's actually a loss of decision-making, because certain decisions we can't make because they would go against US interests. And it would be handy if Australians could overcome this sense of fear that has existed in this country since 1788 and continues to this day, where the other is demonized and we're instinctively afraid of the other. And because of that, we feel insecure. Now, frankly, I've been studying military history for a long time, and Australia is about as secure and safe as you could possibly imagine in the world, okay? It doesn't get more safe than Australia. And yet, Australians, perhaps not the ones in this room, but most Australians, are afraid of the outside world. And because of that, we then have to turn to the great and powerful to protect us. And I'd say also stop being lazy, and I'm saying this to the political class, not to any of you people who are very industrious. But the dependency brings with it the ability to not have to think hard. Our political class has become extraordinarily lazy about thinking about defense matters. And as David Shoebridge was saying, if you look at the documents associated with AUKUS and you read the treaty, there's no way these submarines are showing up. The odds of them appearing, and if you do any kind of hard thinking, you would say the odds of these things showing up, even if you could make a case that we need them, which you can't. But even if you were, okay, they're just not going to appear. And you're just, tossing billions of dollars, into a shredder. And the, end point of the shredder is, American corporations and British corporations. So the American alliance allows our political leaders to not have to think hard. They don't have to do any kind of deep analysis. And when I was in the Department of Defense, it's not just the politicians, it's the senior defense bureaucrats. You don't have to really assess situations and drill down deeply into them and decide what's right and wrong and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Because ultimately, defense of Australia is not Australia's problem in the minds of our political class. It's America's, and they're going to come to our aid if we ever get any trouble. Now, as you might tell by now, you probably figured out that I'm not one of you native-born people. I'm actually from New York, one of the Americans. And I've always felt there's not a chance on hell that America is coming to your rescue if you really get into serious problem. Because a lot of Americans I know don't even know where you are on the map. Okay? So it is all a shell game. But for our politicians, it's a very comfortable shell game because they don't have to think hard and it just costs a few $1 billion. Yeah. And we also need to, and this is perhaps the most important one here, and that's why I'm saving it for last, even though the order is out of place, is we need to broaden the definition of what we mean by security. Okay? And we have a very, very narrow definition. Security means to Australia and to the United States, threats from other countries. And that's not very, that's not good enough. So I just want to bring here, mention this new organization. I was asked to make sure to bring this up. It's new, and you all already have too many organizations to belong to, but you may want to join this one too. But it's the Australian Peace and Security Forum. And some of our objectives is to redefine what the nation believes by national security and put it into a more inclusive, holistic context. And that includes, climate security. Climate and war is one of the things I study. And I have to tell you, I'm not afraid of China, but I'm certainly afraid of climate change. Because if there's something that could destroy this country and our countries in the region, it's climate change. But it's not considered a security threat, and we don't treat it as such. But also human security. The value of the individual, the rights of the individual, our relations with the indigenous population, the challenge of reconciliation. All of those things are things that need to be considered to be included in a proper national security. And economic security, doing something about the growing gap between the wealth of the older classes like myself and that of the next generation or other generations, younger generations. And that's the website if you want to get further information about it. And we're also, I should just mention, just one other advertisement, that on 29 October at 6 p.m. Eastern Central Time, the Australian Security Policy Forum is having a webinar on human security. And you're all welcome to join in. So, how do we fix this? How do we get to something that really works for the country and reduces our dependency on the United States and provides that self-defense that Bevan was talking about before, that the country can achieve? And I fully believe that Australia can have its own self-defense and decrease its reliance on the United States or eliminate this reliance. Now, there's a number of things that we need to establish first as we go through this, and most of these need to be driven by the government. And number one is we need to set a grand strategy. Now, for those of you that may not be familiar with the term, a grand strategy is setting a future goal for the country. It's setting, like in 25, 50 years, what do we want the country to be? Right? Now, Mao did this with China, and China has been working towards, implementing its grand strategy. But it's like all things. If you want to get someplace into the future, you need a destination. You have to understand what you want to be. What kind of nation does Australia want to be? And then once you set that, once you've put that marker down in the future, you can then start implementing the policies that will get you there. And if we want to be an independent nation, in our self-defense, like Switzerland, okay, that's something that we have to decide and put down that marker for the future, and then work towards it. And the government needs to develop a broad national security strategy. That's essentially the policies that you need to implement to get you to achieve your grand strategy. The grand strategy is the objective, the national security strategy is the plan. And this needs to be all-inclusive. There's no reason for it just to include defense against, other states, other nations. This is where you'd also have an environmental policy, a climate policy, a human security policy, policies on what to do with, how to treat refugees. All these kinds of things fall within national security. And our current plan that the government did release in March, I believe, a national security strategy is what it called it. Defense National, yeah. It was written by defense bureaucrats, and looks at the world through the lens of the military. And not surprisingly, all its conclusions center on, the use of violence and force, right? Because it's very narrow. But if you had a multi-agency, task force working on it, you'd get a very different document, one that was truly representative of national security. And of course, here's some of the ways to get going, and Bevan has mentioned this too, invigorate DFAT. It is astonishing at what's been allowed to happen to DFAT. And DFAT should be the primary agency of national security or national defense. And I would argue that the next defense white paper, or all white papers, should be written by DFAT and not by defense. And redesign the ADF for a Defense of Australia role in a defensive sense. Do not build the ADF to be a subset of the US military. And once we have the points 1 and 2 established, then point 3 becomes possible. And right now, it's just simply not possible to redesign the ADF. And of course, there's no reason, other departments are involved in this holistic national security plan. For example, one of the minor departments in Canberra is fisheries. But I would argue fisheries has a very central part in national security, because all those Pacific Island nations have huge, fishery responsibilities. And so if we had our Department of Fisheries incorporated into a national security plan, engaging with these other nations about their fishing policies, well, that would then come back to us in this, sort of circular regional way of promoting peace and stability across the region. And so I guess that's a shorthand way of saying that defense is not the responsibility of defense. It's the responsibility of the government and the nation. And that's, I think, that's where I'm going to end, except for one last ad. And, I have a book coming out next year, early next year, hopefully, which I will be discussing this, and also what I think the Australian Defence Force should look like. And I guess we go back, hand it back over for questions or whatever else.